Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Lisa Nicole Matthews, 114th President of the National Press Club and Assignment Manager for U.S. Video at the Associated Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Newsmaker with NAACP President and CEO Derrick Johnson. We are happy to accept questions from our audience today, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. For more than a century, our country has struggled to reckon with race, and for more than 100 years, the NAACP has been at the forefront of that fight. 2020 has challenged and changed this nation profoundly, as more than 500,000 people, disproportionately people of color, died of COVID-19, as we watched the death of George Floyd under the knee of a police officer. And early this year, as the insurrectionists at the Capitol sought to overturn an election and disenfranchise millions of people, including millions of ballots cast legally by Black American voters. And once again, the NAACP has been called to action. The organization recently joined with Mississippi Congressman Benny Thompson and a civil rights law firm to sue former President Donald Trump, Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and two hate groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, in federal court for conspiring to incite a violent riot at the Capitol on January 6th. The lawsuit alleges that by preventing Congress from carrying out its official duties, Trump, Giuliani, and the far-right groups violated the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. That law was passed by Congress in response to Ku Klux Klan violence that prevented members of Congress in the South from carrying out their duties during Reconstruction. For Mr. Johnson, who assumed leadership of the NAACP in October 2017, it is simply the latest salvo in a tenure that has faced some of the most extraordinary issues and events in history. Under his leadership, Johnson has confronted the NFL about his partnership with Fox, pushed for police reform, and fought for equitable COVID vaccine distribution. The NAACP has also worked to ensure that Black Americans are recognized for their contributions to society. Just a few nights ago, the NAACP Image Awards honored celebrities and artists, including the legendary Eddie Murphy. Today, Mr. Johnson will talk about issues facing Black Americans in these extraordinary times. Mr. Johnson, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Fantastic to have you. So let's start. Let's talk about the Image Awards. Fantastic show the other night. What made this year different than any other?
This was the 52nd Image Awards, and the first time we've ever done a virtual show. It was a challenge. We had to figure out how best to proceed, and based on the feedback we've gotten, we've met the challenge. It was a wonderful expression of Black excellence, and so I want to thank everyone who tuned in for our 52nd Image Award show.
Some of the major awards in Hollywood have notoriously snubbed Black actors. Most recently, there was a Los Angeles Times investigation that reported that the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which bestows the Golden Globes, counts not a single Black journalist among its 87 members. Talk about what needs to change in Hollywood and why the NAACP Image Awards actually has to exist.
So we recognize the power of media early on in our existence. We were established 112 years ago. The second major campaign we took on was to around the release of a movie in 1915, Birth of a Nation, which allowed for a depiction of African Americans to be a very negative stereotype and created a movement that allowed for many of the symbols we're now advocating to be taken down to exist. Confederate monuments, the rise of the Klan, all came from Birth of a Nation. You fast forward to the 40s and 50s, much of our advocacy around a show called Amos and Andy and the depictions of African Americans there. All led up to the establishment of the Image Awards. In fact, some of the early meetings took place in Sammy Davis Jr.'s home because we recognize how people see us on the screen is how we are treated in public policy, how we are treated in the streets, and how the perceptions of other communities relate to African Americans. And the Image Awards is one in which we want to highlight Black excellence to show that we're a dynamic and diverse community. But when you look at situations like Golden Globe, and we recognize that the lack of diversity was so pervasive that not a single African American was a part of it, we must change that. That's our job as NAACP, to advocate for more inclusion so society can see all of our talents across racial and ethnic lines.
So a question that came in from a person who has identified themselves as a white viewer or listener. She says that she wants to know whether the NAACP feels like the name is still accurate. And whether or not the NAACP is focused on all people of color or just the Black community. I know that nowadays when we talk about minorities, we talk about Black and brown minorities. Where does the NAACP fit into that?
In terms of our organization, we have always been a multi-racial organization advocating for equal protection under the law and to ensure democracy work for everyone, just not African Americans, but for everyone. In fact, if you look across our membership now, we have members in 47 states who are active. We have officers from diverse backgrounds, from Native American communities to Latino communities, to the Afro-Latino communities to white Americans. And so we have always and continue to be a very diverse organization. Our grounding, our foundation is in the Black community. We can't fight against discrimination and then turn around and discriminate. And so we worked hard to ensure that was the case. In terms of our names, it shows the legacy and the history and how far we've come as a community. I think NAACP is an appropriate name. It is one of the most recognized brands around the country and around the globe in terms of brand identity. And it's something that we're proud of in our 112-year history.
So let's talk a little bit about politics. So we've got a number of states, Georgia in particular, that has basically started what you could call voter suppression bills around the country. Has the NAACP considered organizing a national boycott of some of those businesses based in Atlanta, or have you like decided to partner with, Stacey Abrams to undo what's being done in the states across the country?
Right. So on Monday, we filed a lawsuit against the state of Georgia for adopting and signing to a bill that was vote suppression. We have to use the remnants of what's left of the Voting Rights Act. Much of what took place in Georgia would not have existed had the Voting Rights Act was in full force. We are looking at and preparing to file a second lawsuit in Texas if they adopt the piece of legislation that's moving through their system. We're looking at all options in terms of not only in the court, but options to get the corporate community engaged. So everything is on the table. In terms of partnerships, we've always been in partnership with Fair Fight. Stacey and I, we've known each other for over 30 years. We actually was just on a call yesterday. So we absolutely have partnered with them. We coordinate. With NAACP, our footprint, our existence is something that is broad and deep. And we really appreciate partnership and collaborations. But one thing that we have learned as an organization over our history, because we are rooted in so many communities across the country, we, as Jesse Jackson will always say, we're the mothership. And we work with all those individuals, organizations that operate in Black community. But NAACP, we are the nation's largest, oldest, and most effective civil rights organization.
What about, somebody might say that the NAACP is the Black Lives Matter of yesteryear. Talk about how you partner or how you work, if you do, with Black Lives Matter, and what, if any, advice you're giving them, or what you are unified on today.
So we must distinguish the concept of Black Lives Matter and the movement. The three young ladies who came up with the hashtag, I talked to all three. They're wonderful, energetic, and focused young ladies who have been on the forefront of so much. Of the three, Patrice Colliers is still engaged in the organization Black Lives Matter, and she and we do collaborate. We talk. I have the proposition that social justice isn't a competition. It is an opportunity for people to add their voices to the conversation. And some of the tools and skills that they've brought to the table has been outstanding. In addition to that, you gotta understand that the thing Black Lives Matter is not about an organization. It's not about a hashtag. It's a value proposition that the lives of Black people in this country matter. It's important. And the concept came out of the fact that we've seen several individuals who are being killed at the hands of police officers, much of which was being taped without justifications. And that rallying cry that, no, you can't just cast us away or treat us inhumane. Our lives matter, our Black lives matter. And in fact, until there's recognition of that value proposition, none of our lives will matter in this country. So we would never fall prey to us versus us proposition. At NAACP, we are the organization of the future. We're the organization of the past with a strong legacy. There is no other organization with a larger set of young people who are advocates than the NAACP. We have youth councils and college chapters all across the country. And many of the activists that are identified now as Black Lives Matter, they also are now and or were officers within the NAACP. It is not a us versus us proposition.
Okay. That's good to know. So since we're talking about Black Lives Matter and the impact of different things, let's talk about the George Floyd situation. Do you think that George Floyd's murder by Mr. Chauvin, and I'm going to call it a murder because I think that's exactly what many people see.
It was.
Yeah. Is it a reckoning for this nation on race? Was it a singular moment, or do you think it was like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back?
I think we're at an inflection point. If you think about this time last year, this nation was on edge because we seen being thrust upon us a global pandemic that we could not recognize, and we lacked a true federal response. And it crippled us. It crippled us in fear. It crippled our economy, and it crippled our ability to navigate the space. In the backdrop of that was the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and the videotape being released right around this time last year, only to learn about the police killing of Breonna Taylor in her bed while she was asleep, to be followed up with the release of information that the COVID-19 virus was having a disastrous impact on community of colors because we were the frontline workers and we held underlying conditions that were not being resolved. That nervousness that we began to see also was amplified because so many of us began to quarantine and we could not go and travel and move around as we used to. Mm. And then we seen the video of George Floyd. All of that was in the backdrop of the previous administration, sowing seeds of hate and division, levels of xenophobia that we had not seen before in recent time, whether you're talking about taking kids at the border or criticizing federal judges because of their ethnic background. Having in the White House a white supremacist like Steve Miller, giving a license to individuals to have a rally in Charlottesville with tiki torch with anti-Semitic language, leading from there to the massacre of a synagogue in Pittsburgh and the killings and attempted massacre of a church in Louisville, Kentucky, in the backdrop of a shooting in Corpus Christi. All of these things have been built up: xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitic, tribalism, like we had not seen. And then we see this video with all that pinned up frustration and fear. But the beautiful thing that came out of that was individuals taken to the streets in peaceful protests behind the value proposition of Black Lives Matter. And all of those individuals, when you look at the crowd, it looked like America, Black and white, young, old, advocating for equal protection under the law, advocating for a more just and humane society. That was a beautiful thing, an inflection point. And even though oppositions tried to make it something else by saying that Antifa was doing something, I have yet to meet a single person identified as Antifa. I don't even know if it exists. I've never been in the presence of anything like that. I've never known anybody to be involved with it, but it was created. And as the press, we have to make sure we don't create opposition where there is no opposition. That was peaceful protest. And when we seen the fires, my question is, was that the Proud Boys? Were those implants trying to create something that was not the case? Because in most cases, it was all peaceful protest, an inflection point that led us to the election in November, an inflection point that led us to see the unfortunate episode on January 6th, an inflection point where we were all watching to see the outcome of this case.
So you talked about what folks are advocating for when they're out marching on the streets. One of the things, the theme that we heard quite a bit was defund the police. Talk about what that means for the NAACP and what actions you'd like to see taken in terms of police reform.
So I think what you said last is best. Police reform. I don't know what defund the police mean in what context and under what theory, but police reform is absolutely important. Part one, you cannot put our law enforcement officers at risk and you have them go out to domestic violent calls and they're not trained to de-escalate scenarios. Part two, you cannot completely gut the funding of mental health and public health support and you ask our law enforcement officers to go on scenes where you have someone who's suffering from a mental health illness. You cannot have communities living in trauma or households living in trauma and you have not properly funded social workers to address the traumas before the bad stuff happened. And our young people need activity. And in far too many of our communities, we have defunded activities for young people for summer baseball or after school programs. Defund, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to say, who's responsible for funding? Is that funding coming from the federal government? Is that a local thing?
It is
the NAACP involved in that?
It's absolutely involved. It is the priority of every budget that touch on society, municipal budgets. And so some people, when they say defund the police, it's not gutting police because our communities want to be served and protected. It is saying that you're building up the budgets for law enforcement agencies at the expense of after school and summer programs for young people, at the expense of mental health support, at the expense of social workers to address trauma. We're saying that the concept of police reform need to be done in which there is a national database of police misconduct so individuals can't go from one law enforcement agency and be dismissed and go to another. Neither the agency they're going to or the public know that this is a bad actor. We're saying that this concept of qualified immunity should not be afforded with a blank slate so people can operate above the law because they carry a badge, when in fact, many of the people carrying a badge, unfortunately, need mental health support themselves or they should not be carrying a badge. So reform is something that's necessary and reform can help all of society because now we will right-size the services that people are paying into with their tax dollars, and those tax dollars should reflect the needs and interests of those communities, whether it's local municipalities, counties, states, or federal.
So I hate to even bring this up, but it's a reality that I think news organizations are preparing for, and I think police are preparing for. If the situation with the George Floyd, Derrick Chauvin trial doesn't result in a guilty verdict of some sort, are you prepared for what could potentially happen? And are you working like behind the scenes to calm people down so that we don't see random violence in the streets in response to what could potentially be a not so, people don't appreciate the verdict that comes out from the case?
I hate to start from a negative premise that somehow if A happened, the reaction is going to be violence. We should start from a premise that what's on trial is our criminal justice system. What's on trial is the right for a Black man to breathe in America. What's on trial is the right for a Black man to go through a process where there's due process and law enforcement officers are not coming on a scene and try, convict, and punish to death based on some level of assumptions. That's what's on trial. But also, is this nation prepared for an outcome that put us in the eye of a global community who all witnessed what we witnessed? George Floyd was not resisting arrest. George Floyd was not complying with commands of those officers. George Floyd was in a docile position, laying flat on his stomach, and they had already handcuffed him. There is no rationale for George Floyd to be killed in broad daylight with onlookers with cameras on for the accusation of a $20 counterfeit bill. There is no rationale for that. So what's on trial is our criminal justice system, and we must ask not only the city of Minneapolis or the state of Minnesota, but America. Are we prepared for outcome that's less than just?
Let me just ask you one more question about police reform. What do you think it will change? What do you think it will take for police interactions to change with the Black community? What has to change in order for that to change?
So I want to be very clear. There are many, many law enforcement officers and agencies that they get it right. They're doing well and in strong partnership with the African American community across the country. We're talking about those agencies and those officers who are not being held accountable. Accountability is something that you and I and everyone that's on this Zoom, we are responsible for. Why should certain individuals who've been sworn to protect and serve be given license to harm and harass? That's what we're talking about. I grew up in a city where in high school I was a police cadet. Officer Conway was someone that we all love. Smitty, another police officer, we all love. And anytime we would act like we were going sideways, they would step in like, no, not this one, you come with me. And we get chastised, and it worked out. Thank God it worked out. But there are far too many communities without an Officer Conway or a Smitty that they can see and they can talk to, who will, on a basketball court, they'll come and pick up the ball and shoot around with you. Because the relationship between law enforcement agencies and communities should be something that's positive, that's welcome, because it is those same communities' tax dollars that's paying for those agencies to exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we talked a little bit, I talked a little bit about this in the introduction, and today we learned that 2 Capitol police officers have filed a lawsuit against Donald Trump. And we also have the NAACP that has filed a lawsuit against Donald Trump. Talk a little bit about the lawsuit and what all it involves and where you are in the process.
So after witnessing the horrific scene of January 6th, where, just suppose I've seen this image where you had insurrectionists, treasonous actions attacking the Capitol, busting out windows, beating police officers, murdering a police officer, and yet they want to say Blue Lives Matter. They're doing this. And you have a member of the Georgia legislative body asking the question, why aren't we allowed to go in on the signing of a bill? And she's knocking on the door, not beating on the door, not knocking out a window, and she get arrested. She's legitimately in her place of business, carrying out her duties, making an appropriate request. Why are these doors open? We want to be in this room when this is signed. That's a part of her responsibility. She get arrested, and you have insurrectionists committing treason. Insurrectionists committing treason, and they killed a police officer. For the NAACP, we understand history. The Civil Rights Act of 1871 was created because Southern members of Congress were being harassed and intimidated because of the positions they were taking to reunify the country after the Civil War. And that law was put in place so they can carry out their duties and not be harassed and intimidated. And if they were, they can bring suit against groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which was one of the primary groups. There was many others of the time. What we seen on January 6th was Klan-like activities from the 1800s. And in Section 1 of that act allows members of Congress to bring suit so they would not be harassed and intimidated. And so we're representing Congressman Benny Thompson, the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, and several other members of Congress who have now joined in on the lawsuit to say to all those groups, including the former president, that you will be held liable for seeking to subvert democracy, to commit a treasonous act, to create insurrection at our nation's capital while the world was looking. That's the role of that lawsuit, and we are pursuing it as aggressively as possible.
What sort of reaction, if any, have you received from former President Trump or Rudy Giuliani or any of the folks on the opposite side of the suit?
Well, they've now entered their appearance in terms of the lawsuit, and I can only assume as the lawsuit progresses and we gather more evidence, it's a court proceedings now. That needed to happen. Why? Because if we allow that type of activity to go unaccounted for, history has shown us if you allow domestic terrorism to take place and no one held accountable, you can be guaranteed there will be more acts of domestic terrorism. For African Americans all through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, we see acts of domestic terrorism and nobody was held accountable. That's why Emmett Till was killed. That's why Medgar Evers was assassinated. That's why so many people were harmed and harassed throughout the Southern landscape because nobody was ever held accountable. We must continue to fight to ensure that domestic terrorism is not spread across this country.
So what does Congress have to do that? Because I think we've been talking about domestic terrorism since Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City. Why do you think that nothing has been done to kind of institute a law that specifically addresses that? And if that were to become some kind of action or a law, how would the NAACP work to make sure that becomes a law?
Yeah, he was a white supremacist, and many of the individuals who were planned out and carried out activities on January 6th, there is a direct relationship to Timothy McVeigh. That's an example. When you allow domestic terrorism to go unaccounted for, then you can assure there will be more acts. In addition to that, we got to address structural racism in this country. If any of these acts were carried out by someone from the Middle East or someone who was not white, you will see the full force of the government come down on them so hard that there will be no question that people are being held accountable. But we allow just under the surface this era of white supremacy and domestic terrorism to exist without calling it for what it is. The face of domestic terrorism has consistently been white males, and we have not dealt with that. We need an aggressive approach to address domestic terrorism to keep our democracy intact and to keep people safe.
Not too long ago, we had a senator, I believe it was Ron Johnson, who made a comment about he would have only been worried had those folks that attacked the Capitol, if they didn't look like the ones who came on the Capitol. So do we have a problem in Congress too?
Absolutely. That's been shown. The impeachment trial laid out so much information, but in addition to that, the information that's been gathered since then showing that there are members of Congress that are problematic. We're taking the position of NAACP that any member of Congress who refuses to certify the election should not be the benefactor of corporate support. And if they are, it brings the question to those corporations, why are you supporting individuals who are seeking to subvert democracy? The concept of the big lie isn't anything new, that you keep repeating the same lie over and over, that others begin to repeat it and begin to operate as if it's true. What happened January 6th is a result of the big lie, elections being stolen. There is no evidence, no proof that an election was stolen that would have prevented the peaceful transfer of power. And because that big lie is still being told, because so many members of Congress refuse to acknowledge that the election was decided in a transparent and open process, and that if it's a due process approach in which evidence can be presented to overturn, and nothing was ever presented, they are refusing to accept that President Biden, Vice President Harris are duly elected in a fair process. And when they do that, just below the surface, they allow for this level of people thinking it's okay to attack our democracy, to participate in insurrectionist activity, and to commit treason.
Yeah, extraordinary times we're living in. And the NAACP has been really busy following those lawsuits. So another lawsuit that you filed, that the NAACP has filed, is one with Fox, with the NFL. You wrote to Roger Goodell a couple of weeks ago, the NFL commissioner, urging the NFL to pull its business from Fox. Tell us why you took that action.
So in terms of the Fox Corporation, what we learned through research, and actually in partnership with Media Matters, is that Fox News have been losing sponsorship for years now. And the way they're able to maintain their operation is through demanding higher, what they call carriage fees from cable providers. Right. And in doing so, they inflate the cost, and they can maintain and generate profit by stating that either you take us as a package or we won't allow you to have football games.
That's now, football is
that's right.
Yeah.
And you have lookout. So the negotiation around carriage fees, what the Fox Corporation has been doing is spreading the opportunity to Fox News so they can underwrite that coverage on the back of NFL players who Fox News constantly criticized. Even on the day of the insurrection, Fox News was carrying stories about players taking the knee and criticizing them for not being patriotic. Now, that is not only unfortunate because the news is living off the back of those players because of Fox Corporation's leveraging the NFL. And we're simply saying, we want football. We find that Fox Sports carry football, but this got to be decoupled so that the NFL is not subsidizing negative news, because those of you who are members of the press, we all know that Fox is not a news station. I hate to even say Fox News. It is information that misdirects, malign, and lie. They cannot uphold much of their coverage to any level of journalistic integrity.
All righty. Well, we have some members who are employees of Fox News, so I'm not going to go down that road because I know that there are some strong folks who are trying to do journalism good, despite being in a place like that. Talk about what this whole situation says for the NFL's relationship with Black football players. Where do they go from here?
Well, we're going to keep pushing. We honestly believe that the NFL should not allow itself to be positioned to be leveraged for that station to continue to seek ways to subvert democracy, to further tribalism, to push out racism, anti-Semitic statements. I mean, we can't afford to do this anymore. The tool of race and division is a powerful tool for political outcomes. But when you tip the boat where people feel so emboldened that they're willing to cause harm, that they're willing to become insurrectionists, that they're willing to allow our nation and this democracy to be something that's unrecognizable, where are the limits? Where are the guardrails? And we start at Fox news station because that's what the problem. It's not the individuals who work there, it's the corporate culture. And you may have some great people there, but at the end of the day, the integrity of that station's coverage is at question. It has always been at question, and it remains to be at question.
Okay, let's talk about COVID. So today, Pfizer announced.
So you're trying to soften it up a little bit? Okay,
yeah,
here we go.
I'm gonna get off of that. We're gonna talk about COVID, even though that's not solved. Okay, that's just as deep as anything else we've been talking about. And at the end of this, you're gonna tell us, how it is that you ended up in the chair that you're in, because you're taking on some serious stuff, Derrick. Okay, on COVID. There's serious hesitancy in the Black and Brown community about getting vaccinated. What do you do as the NAACP to get the word out to folks that you need to get vaccinated, that this is for your own good? I have to ask you a personal question. Have you been vaccinated?
Absolutely. Moderna.
Yeah. Moderna. Yeah, I got my first Moderna. So how do we convince folks that you're not being someone told me that I was being a lab monkey, a guinea pig. That's not really the case, right?
So Karen Bass, Congresswoman Karen Bass, she and I had this conversation. She had some research done. It is not as much hesitancy in the Black community as it is availability. And that's what we've learned, that if you make the things available, people are actually getting shots. Think about, this administration said he want to have 100 million shots in the first 100 days. That happened within the first 50 days. Right. And now they're talking about 2 million shots. That's not because people in African-American people are hesitant. What we are learning is the more the vaccine becomes available, the more people are taking the vaccine, and the more of us who have platforms to communicate with broad individuals say, listen, I took it as well. The more you find people taking the shot. Everyone in my household of age have taken the shot. That's really important. We, for the first time in, I believe, this nation's history, we found ourselves in the midst of a global health pandemic, and we didn't have a federal response. We had a state-by-state response, which crippled our economy for several months, which crippled how we function in this country, which actually paralyzed so much of what we have grown accustomed to because we lacked the federal response. Now, finally, we can speak in a way in which we can look forward to getting back to whatever we call normal, because more people are stepping up and taking the vaccine. We're learning more about what's taking place. We're learning more about the spread of the virus. We're learning more about how it is impacting other nations, and we are adapting more and more best practices. For the NAACP, we're not telling people to take the virus. We're telling people, understand your options, educate yourself, and make the right decision to keep yourself safe, to keep your family safe, to keep our community safe.
So that's what I was going to be my next question is what specifically is the NAACP doing on the ground to get people to where they can be vaccinated and to get them the information that they need?
Education. We have a whole campaign just to educate people. That we're not telling people, because we don't know how people are situated in their health and their personal space. What we're saying is that we must continue to be socially distanced. We must continue to wear a mask. And here's an option that you can have in terms of vaccine. You can choose all or one or two of these things, but these things are important because if you care about your family, if you care about yourself, if you care about your community, let's keep people safe. Let's keep you safe. Let's make sure our loved ones are protected.
Have you had an opportunity to meet with the White House COVID task force or with President Biden or Vice President Harris about COVID specifically or any other issues impacting the Black community?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was really pleased with the special task force they put together. Dr. Marcia Nunez is an NAACP from Connecticut. She helped us some years ago project. She's very competent, wonderful person. I'm pleased with the new leadership at the CDC. They're taking this moment very serious. We actually held a call with them prior to the president being sworn in on January 20th, and we talked about strategies and approaches that will be important to get the information out. So that's COVID specific. We have been in ongoing communication with the new administration, including the president and vice president. As you watched the Image Awards show, they were on the show. They opened the show up. This is an administration that has embraced all of who we are as Americans and invited input and opened up dialogue. Neither the president or the vice president, they're both very familiar with NAACP, as both of them are life members. But at the exact same time, as we navigate and look forward as a nation, as an organization, it will be through the current leadership to get us out of the most recent past of division, of tribalism, and of the level of just negative reaction to things that we should be looking forward to, like being good neighbors with our neighbors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's something that we try to do at the National Press Club. You may not know this, but we offer free 1-year memberships to graduates of historically Black colleges and universities whose students major in journalism. So, and along that, I'm wondering, what is it that the NAACP is doing to help college students who are dealing with an insurmountable amount of debt? And do we still have the United Negro College Fund? And
absolutely.
Does NAACP work with it? You don't hear about it as much anymore.
Well, we recall for years they had the commercial, mine is a terrible thing to waste.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But Dr. Lomax and the UNCF, they are as strong as I've ever seen the UNCF, and they're doing good work. One of our major campaigns is to elimination of student loan debt. And we find student loan debt is as paralyzing to African-American social mobility than anything else. It is a crisis that's looming, similar to the housing market crisis. And so 3 things here. 1, anyone who was lured into a for-profit college scenario, which had people to maximize all their debt, among other things, for degrees that were not certified nor marketable, we believe because the government helped sanction that activity, all of their debt should be wiped away. In many cases, these are individuals who are the lowest income earners in our community seeking to get a ladder up. Secondly, we believe that individuals who are currently in or qualified to be in the public service student loan discharge program, that debt should be addressed. These are individuals who work for federal government, who work for state government, who work for local government. These are frontline workers who did everything necessary to be in a position, not recognizing their service to our community will be a penalty because they are not paid the same as in the private sector and is saddled with debt. Think about all of the teachers who are leaving the profession because being a teacher may not be a marketable degree if they have to bounce between mortgage, life, and student loan debt. That debt should be discharged based on an existing program. And that also includes some of the nonprofit organizations that's doing great work to society, like the Peace Corps. And then thirdly, there needs to be an approach to look at how student loan debt is furthering structural racism. Because of credit debt ratios, we are unable in many communities to really purchase homes, purchase cars. It's a stimulus opportunity that we should look at so that individuals who actually, people who are in our society contributing mightily can get some relief. So that's how we're looking at the campaign. And it's something that I think is really important if we want our economy to move forward.
Now, I'm betting some folks who are listening to this are going, okay, Derrick, is there an application? Is there a website I need to go to so that if I can be represented? Because, I fell for that bogus that bogus education, that bogus degree? How do they do that?
I don't know if it's a website. It's a campaign. We are pushing the administration, the House, and the Senate that there need to be some debt relief for those individuals who got caught in those for-profit scams. I mean, Trump University was one of those for-profit scams. Bessie DeVos was a part of that for-profit scam. And so if people were being scammed and the federal government allowed for that to happen for so many years, there should be some support for those individuals to remedy the harm. Student loan debt is very difficult to get discharged, even in bankruptcy. And so it's almost like people walking around with a dead scarlet letter in which they cannot get away from.
So some questions from folks listening. How is the NAACP reaching out to younger people in the community so that they feel that the organization aligns with their needs? And I know you spoke a little bit earlier about how some of the folks who are Black Lives Matters leaders are also members of the NAACP. But can you talk more concretely about outreach and the connection between organizations for young people specifically?
Absolutely. So NAACP, we have the largest group of organized youth activists, advocates in the country. We've had that for over 85 years. This is the 85th year of our youth and college division. In fact, I got involved as a college chapter president, and I was a state youth and college division president. Many individuals across the country can also speak to that. Our job as an organization is to make sure that young people can lend their voices to social justice movement. And if they choose a vehicle like the NAACP, outstanding. If they choose another vehicle, great. As a legacy organization, as a large organization, it is our role to ensure more people voices are heard. So you will find in some communities, we have presidents who are 28 years old, 32 years old, 35 years old. I'm thinking of specific individuals. The president of the Minneapolis branch of the NAACP in the midst of George Floyd, who organized much of the protest, was a 30-year-old lawyer. And she was phenomenal, young activist. And she pulled together a Zoom conversation with the other youth leaders on the ground who was identifying as a part of all the organizations you could think of in that community. And I was so proud because most of them looked up to her as their adult leader. Now she's 30 years old, but she was the older person in the room. That's our role. Our role is to create space for voice. And people choose their voice a vehicle. And if they choose our college chapter, our youth council, great. And if they don't, our role is to create the space and support that voice in social justice.
Gotcha. Another question from a listener, actually, let me go back to this. Daryl Holly had a question. And bear with me because we are in a Zoom world and I'm trying to get things off of the iPad here. Let me go back. So this has to do about the legacy of the NAACP. And he's wondering, you take on so many different issues. Where do you see yourself really leading? What is your lead issue? I mean, for this year and for just for people of color in general?
You know, I've had that question before, and I wish I could shrink us to an issue and an approach. We're too big for that. We are in 47 states, 2,200 units across the country. We're a bottom-up structure where our members across the country inform our policy priorities and issues that we take on. So if you can imagine this, if it was a community that lived in the shadow of a nuclear plant, guess what the issue would be in that community? Environmental justice. If there's a community that lack clean water, guess what that issue is going to be? If our chapter or our branch in a particular area is made up of retired teachers, guess what their priority is going to be? Education. We're too large to be singular and focused because our community is so diverse, so dynamic. We are informed by that community. And in some communities, it could be voting rights work, or that's what we see in Georgia, now emerging in Texas. And other communities, it's the removal of Confederate symbols. We just filed a lawsuit yesterday in North Carolina for the removal of Confederate symbol. Why? Because that local community say, we don't want this to represent our community anymore. So I wish we could be singular and focused. It'll make my job easier. No, we are diverse, and we're diverse because we are all across the country, from Hawaii to Alaska, from Connecticut to Florida, and all places in between.
You know, hearing you mention water, and it made me think about Flint, Michigan. Where are we with the situation in Flint, Michigan, and what is the NAACP doing to make sure that that situation is not forgotten?
Well, what's unfortunate, Flint is one of many cities that have the same problem. Flint was highlighted. We are in the midst of the lawsuit, but more importantly, the big infrastructure bill that's being considered now in Congress, that's the conversation we're in. And we want to make sure that resources from the infrastructure bill go to cities like Flint, Michigan, like Jackson, Mississippi, like Columbia, South Carolina. And it's a direct appropriation, so the state won't interfere with the infrastructure build out and improvements that's required in this moment. An infrastructure bill that can put people back to work, an infrastructure bill that can address the crumbling roads and bridges, an infrastructure bill that can give our economy a jump start so that we don't continue to revisit what we've seen. The largest and most sustained growth of our economy is a result of the New Deal policies of the mid-1930s. Make no mistakes about it. It was not cutting taxes. It was not the private sector. It was about government playing the role necessary to put people back to work, to get our economy going, so that all citizens can have the basic quality of life that this society should provide, particularly this leading nation on the globe.
So Joe Biden is talking about President Biden. I shouldn't say Joe Biden. President Biden is in Pittsburgh today talking about infrastructure. If you were with him today, or if you had a moment with him to talk about the importance of infrastructure, what would you tell him he needs to address first?
I don't think it's the first. Again, I think it's all at the same time. This infrastructure package that's being considered, one thing I said, we shouldn't dumb it down. We shouldn't shrink it. We should make sure it's as robust as possible, because we won't have this opportunity probably for another 50 years to build our infrastructure. So one, make sure it is as robust as possible so we can put people back to work and we can build out our infrastructure. Two, make sure we do it where people can get employed, not the money going to the private sector, but for people to be employed. And then thirdly, make sure it is equitable in its distribution.
Gotcha. Well, before I ask the final question, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Limewan and Lori Russo. Today's headliner event coordinator, Gemma Puglisi, and Club Communications Director, Lindsay Underwood, and Club Executive Director, Bill McCarron. I'd also like to thank the folks in our broadcast operations center who are responsible for the lighting and just making sure that everything goes right whenever we do these Zoom events. I'd also like to tell you about some upcoming National Press Club headliners. Join us tomorrow at 2:00 to welcome the start of the 2021 baseball season. We're going to have a virtual headliners book event featuring former Washington Senators announcer Phil Hochberg and former AP reporter Fred Frommer, author of You Gotta Have Heart, Washington Baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series champion Nationals. And at 2 p.m., get your shoulder ready if you haven't been vaccinated. On April 6th, we'll hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and chief medical advisor to President Biden, who will discuss the latest developments in the COVID-19 pandemic and the status of the nation's vaccination program. We hope you'll join us. Now for our final question. Drum roll, please. So, Derrick, how did you get involved in the NAACP? I heard you mention a little bit about doing it in college, but how did you get involved and why did you decide that this was the work that you wanted to do? this was the career you wanted to have?
I never thought this would be the career I would have, but I got involved in undergrad. And when I went to a state meeting, I didn't know anybody there, but the people who were speaking, I started recognizing their name, and I realized these were people I had been reading about in a history book, and I was hooked. The fact that I could read a book about Brown versus Board of Education or what was taking place in the 1960s, and these were older gentlemen and ladies, and they were in the room, I was like, they're still alive. This was in 1990. And I've been immersed in the organization and the work ever since. But always on the volunteer side until I accepted this position 3.5 years ago.
So what's been the most challenging thing for you in the position? And have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're at the table and nobody gets you, no one gets, why is there still an NAACP? Do you find yourself in a situation where you have to explain the reason for the NAACP to exist anymore?
So I stopped explaining the organization that existed years ago. Right? I'm an only child, so sometimes I'm tone deaf to what's at the table. I'm more focused on why we're at the table and the outcomes we're pursuing, and I go after that. And in many cases, when we do that effectively, you don't have to explain the relevancy of the organization because people are trying to catch up to you with the work that you're doing. And if the work leads and not the relevancy, then people understand the relevancy and to join in the work if they're sincere.
Well, it was wonderful talking to you. Again, Derrick Johnson, CEO of the NAACP. We really appreciate your time today and your insights, and wish you best of luck in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.